So I'll start in terms of just broad U.S. policy in terms of our engagements with the continent. It is evident that in today's 21st century world, the challenges that we face, the global challenges that we face, can't be done and can't be overcome without partnerships, and that includes partnerships with our African partners. And so we very much appreciate from the very beginning of the Biden-Harris administration, there's been an engagement, an effort to grow those partnerships across the continent, not only with obviously governments, but with the people of Africa. As you may recall, in his first month in office, President Biden addressed the African Union leaders when they met in Addis in February of 2021, and made clear that the United States, again, wanted to have a strong partnership and build on previous efforts. I was at that time serving, as was noted, as the United States ambassador to the DRC in Kinshasa, and we recognized that it was quite important for us to step up our engagement and our efforts. He then followed up with that initial engagement to host the African Leaders Summit, which I'm sure you're all quite familiar with, in December of 2022, where he had around 50 leaders from the continent come to Washington. And I know you're probably quite well aware that he had anticipated a trip to the continent as a follow-up to Angola. It had to be postponed due to Hurricane Milton that hit Florida, but now it's been rescheduled, and he'll intend to travel in December. A few key elements. Again, these are issues I'm sure you're familiar with, but just taken from the United States National Security Strategy towards Sub-Saharan Africa that was issued in August of 2022. You'll see there for yourselves, the effort, as I've been talking about, growing partnership to support the mantra that we hear very constantly from the African Union of supporting African solutions for African problems, to deliver democratic and security dividends, to foster openness and open societies, to advance pandemic recovery and economic opportunity. And of course, when we were talking about pandemic, initially it was COVID that we're overcome, but right now it's quite topical because you're seeing concerns over Marburg disease that has hit Central Africa and other countries, especially affecting Rwanda at the moment. And so the issues of addressing health remain at the forefront as we want to make sure that provide the support both for the African people and to prevent the spread or the possibility of further pandemics. When I was in DRC, we worked on Ebola quite a bit. We had 4 outbreaks in my 4 years there. And then to support conservation, climate adaptation, and a just energy transition. As we move forward, and now to concentrate a little bit in where I have my purview. I've had my purview over the last couple of years, almost 2.5 years. I'm sure you're all familiar with the broad, geography on the continent, but this is the area in the region that I'll be focusing my remarks today, and where I hope our discussion will be focused. So I won't repeat what the countries are, but approximately 8 countries there on the Horn. And my initial mandate was very focused on Ethiopia, as you can imagine, because back in 2022, there was a raging war, in fact, the bloodiest war in the world at the time, in northern Ethiopia, affecting the region of Tigray. And I understand there may be a Tigrayan, at least one in the room, or perhaps online there'll be Ethiopians as well. And we can talk a bit about that and how that was brought to an end. Again, some of the reasons why it's important for the United States to be focused, and why, in fact, the Biden administration established the position of the Special Envoy for the Horn of Africa, of which I had 2 predecessors, Ambassador Jeff Feltman and then Ambassador David Satterfield, so I'm the third. And so it's because of, again, the vast expanse of trade that goes through the Red Sea, 10% of the world's trade, youngest population in the world. Of course, there are issues of democracy, issues of terrorism, which we'll talk about, and certainly climate change, which is fueling insecurity. I'll go through several of the countries that we've been working on. Again, in the discussion, I'm sure there'll be comments, questions where we can delve deeper into some of the salient issues. Djibouti is quite significantly important because of its strategic location. And the United States has its one base in Africa, in Djibouti, Camp Lemonnier, with around 2,000 troops there to conduct a number of operations. And mostly it's support of humanitarian operations, or if we need to be partnering with any of our African countries on a number of issues, then we have closer opportunities from Djibouti. And more recently, we've seen really quite a bit of concern in the Red Sea because of the Houthi attacks that have been disrupting shipping. On Ethiopia, as I mentioned, we've spent quite a bit of time, and we have 4 broad policy goals for Ethiopia, the second largest country and population-wise in sub-Saharan Africa, with more like 120 million. And you have, of course, the interest that we have and shared with Ethiopians of strengthening democratic institutions and expanding human rights. Want to promote economic growth and development. We, of course, want to ensure that there's regional peace and security. And our embassy in Addis is very focused, of course, on the well-being of American citizens. And I'm proud to say that the United States, the U.S. taxpayer, is the most generous of all in terms of being the largest contributor of humanitarian and other assistance bilaterally to Ethiopia. So when I took this job, we had really quite a horrific situation, as I alluded to, in the affected regions, mostly affected Tigray, but also Amhara and Afar in northern Ethiopia, which, as I mentioned, was the deadliest conflict at the time. And whereas Secretary Blinken said in March of 2023, when he traveled to Ethiopia, there had been crimes committed against humanity, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing that were perpetrated by the various warring parties in Ethiopia, including Eritrea. And we also saw, of course, a tragedy of widespread starvation and hunger. And so immediately upon taking this job, we started working, and as my predecessors had, primarily with the African Union, also with the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, to try to see how we might be able to promote a peace agreement. There were some quiet discussions that led to what then became the Pretoria Cessation of Hostilities Agreement that was signed almost to the day 2 years ago in November of 2022. And it was really, I think, a very good example of the type of cooperation, the United States participating as an observer, along with the United Nations and the Intergovernmental Authority on Development. We supported the African Union's efforts to bring the government of Ethiopia into an agreement with TPLF, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, and to finally bring about a silencing of the guns that fortunately has held for the past 2 years, which is quite remarkable. When we signed the agreement in November of 22, most of my colleagues that had been working on mediation efforts around the world were quick to point out that most cessation hostilities agreements actually do not last. And so while we can be quite frustrated that we still haven't seen more progress, and I'll get into some of the outstanding issues, the reality is the guns were silenced almost immediately. We saw a cessation of the fighting and bringing an end to the suffering that had been experienced mostly by the Tigrayan people, but also affected the people in Amhara and Afar, and started a process of demobilization that included heavy weapons on the part of the TPLF, and then establishment, as you know, of the interim regional administration, a restoration of services, which was critical. What has lagged and has been frustrating that it's taken this long is a return of internally displaced people to their homes. That needs to be done securely, and certainly it is something that we, the United States, through the work of the African Union, have been urging happen in a secure fashion. And certainly there have been reviews already of the cessation hostilities agreement over the past year that have shown some progress, but nonetheless, we need to continue. Also, a more expansive program of demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration needs to occur that would bring down the number of fighters that remain in the Tigrayan Defense Forces, and that those people, combatants, ex-combatants, be able to return to their daily lives and not consider going or returning to conflict as still a viable option. And I know that perhaps when we go to the Q&A, we may talk about a little bit about the current tensions that exist even within Tigrayan authorities between the TPLF and the interim regional administration. But so far, again, 2 years in, the peace has held, even though we can talk about now grave concerns over the conflict that is raging now in neighboring Amhara, as well as further south in Oromia. And it is U.S. policy to encourage the government of Ethiopia and the parties, the belligerent parties, to try to resolve differences through peaceful means, as we did in terms of the dialogue that led to this cessation of hostilities agreement. Also in the talks that I was privileged to participate in between the government of Ethiopia and the Oromo Liberation Army, when we did that in the fall of 23, nearly a year ago. We were in Dar es Salaam trying to, again, try to reach an agreement that would bring peace to Oromia. And as Ambassador Masinga, Ambassador Naddis has made clear in a May 15th speech earlier this year, we stand ready to support any peace efforts through dialogue that can bring an end to the conflict in Amhara. We also, as Secretary Blinken said when he was in Addis in March of 23, he made clear that we, the United States, support efforts at transitional justice and continuing efforts to protect human rights and to hold accountable those who perpetrated those horrific acts of violence, including gender-based violence. And lastly, of course, is the concern of trying to bring reconstruction to the region. Of course, there are many competing demands, even since the silencing of the guns in Tigray. We've seen the horrific war that has exploded in Sudan next door. And of course, we have the situations in Gaza and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So demands for funding for reconstruction are pretty high around the world today. Just to give you a little sense of the amount of aid that goes from the United States to Ethiopia through the U.S. Agency for International Development, you see there over $3 billion in assistance for fiscal years 22 and 23. We are committed to continuing humanitarian assistance as best as possible. You may be aware that we had to discontinue humanitarian assistance for about 6 months last year because it was being diverted either to feed militaries, whether it was the Tigrayan military or the Ethiopian, or used for profit. And that was very unfortunate because it meant that food that was being provided with the money from U.S. taxpayers was being misused, and that needed to be corrected. So we worked with the Ethiopian government and also regional officials, not only in Tigray, but other regions affected, to make sure that there was a better distribution network that held it to the highest standards to ensure, again, that those people most in need would be able to receive the aid that they very much deserve and needed. One of the issues that I spent quite a bit of time during my tenure was in trying to work out the tensions between Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan over the construction of the Ethiopian Grand Renaissance Dam, known as GERD, which, as you know, flows down into Sudan and Egypt. And for Egypt, issues of water are of an existential nature. And so we were involved in diplomatic negotiations together with the United Arab Emirates to try to find a way forward. The dam, the GERD, is essentially built through its fifth filling this past summer. And fortunately, there's been no noticeable significant harm to downstream countries, but it remains an issue of concern and one in which we, the United States, remain prepared to support, again, diplomatic efforts that can address the issues of concern regarding the flow of water in a way that satisfies the national interests of Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt. If we go further afield to Somalia, you're probably well aware, well, first in terms of U.S. policy, we are dedicated to supporting the federal government of Somalia in its fight against al-Shabaab, and we have a persistent presence that is supporting those counterterrorism efforts. We also are working to support strengthening of democratic institutions and governance, and of course, continuing humanitarian plight through droughts. But it is unfortunate that on January 1st of this year, we had news of a memorandum of understanding that was reached between the government of Ethiopia and Somaliland, which created quite a bit of tension. As U.S. policy has been clearly stated, we support Somalia's territorial sovereignty, integrity, and unity. And we've been trying to encourage both countries to move beyond this MOU and to move to a cooperative relationship that helps address the real issues of concern in the region, including the fight against al-Shabaab. And this is important because since the MOU, it is fair to say that the federal government of Somalia has been distracted, as have others, from the core issue, which is the fight against al-Shabaab, at a time when there is information that the Houthis are looking to establish links to al-Shabaab. So the terrorism issue is very salient and concerning. And we are in a period during which the ATMIS mission that is currently serving to do counterterrorism in Somalia is expiring at the end of this year, and there's going to be a new mission. And so we need to overcome, again, some of the tensions between Ethiopia and Somalia so that both countries, together with neighbors, whether it's Kenya or Djibouti or other countries, Uganda, can contribute to work that helps to promote peace and stability in the region. Sudan, we could spend all afternoon, and I'm sure there'll be a rich discussion on the situation of Sudan, which is rather tragic. We have been dedicated since the outbreak of the war in October of, in April of 23, so well over a year, on April 15th, to try to find a diplomatic resolution that would bring the SAF and RSF to stop the slaughter of Sudanese people, and to try to get an agreement that will also enable a return to civilian rule. And I spent 2 weeks with my colleague, and we have now a special envoy for Sudan, former Congressman Tom Perriello, who's working day and night to try to, again, improve the humanitarian situation, first and foremost, to try to arrive at a ceasefire, and then to support Sudanese civilians who will be the ones who determine the future of Sudan, and therefore we want to have a return to civilian governance. We spent 2 weeks in August in Switzerland, working with a number of other countries and organizations, with the African Union. We worked with with Egypt and the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, which had been at Jeddah hosting the Jeddah talks and the Jeddah Declaration, the Swiss, and of course the UN. We also continue to work with IGAD, as I mentioned before. Not only did we work in South Africa on the Tigray peace process, but they're also an integral part of the efforts to try to bring peace to Sudan. And it's very important that the international world attention is focused on Sudan, and we do the best that we can to highlight the plight of the Sudanese people and to ensure that assistance is being delivered, or at least that routes are opened for them. Secretary Blinken, together with his French and German and EU counterparts, hosted a ministerial when we were in New York during the UN General Assembly this past September. And we've continued to urge the parties, both Generals Burhan and Hemeti, to do what is right for Sudan, bring an end to this horrific violence and fighting, to allow for humanitarian assistance to flow, and again, to begin the transition that needs to occur to a civilian governance. You will see President Biden spoke to the issue of Sudan at this year's UN General Assembly. I included a quote from his remarks. I won't read it here, but you see very much that the administration is concerned about the plight of the Sudanese people and situation there, and are calling for an end to this war. Spend a couple minutes on South Sudan, which has just reached its 13th birthday, still youngest country, having gained its independence in 2011. They've now, you've probably seen, talked about deferring of elections for another 2 years. While we agree that the elections were not ripe or ready to be free and fair in December of this year, we are concerned about the long delay, and frankly, more needs to be done to live up to past agreements so that the international community can be there in support of the South Sudanese people. So there's another country that is going still through growing pains, if you will, but where the leadership needs to start abiding by commitments made. Eritrea, I wish I had more to say on Eritrea, but unfortunately, the United States doesn't have much of a relationship with Asmara by their choice, and therefore we hope to be in a better position where through diplomatic engagements we could hope to improve both the human rights situation in Eritrea, but also to ensure, for example, the complete withdrawal of Eritrean troops from northern Ethiopia, and frankly, to ensure that there's a complete implementation of the cessation of hostilities agreement for northern Ethiopia. Kenya, perhaps one of the bright lights in the region. We had a celebration and a recognition of the U.S. Kenya strategic partnership, as you probably saw and read about when President Ruto participated in a state visit to Washington in May of this year, where he also traveled to Atlanta. We have longstanding mutual interests and cooperation, and we very much appreciate, for example, Kenya's contributions with the deployment of police to Haiti. So we work with the Kenyan government on a full range of issues, but first and foremost, of course, in trying to advance peace, security, and economic growth in the Horn of Africa. And that concludes sort of the formal part of my presentation.